My name is Jason Rosenzweig, and I stand here before you in my new position as the first director of Chicago for Shalom Hartman Institute. Sure. With great excitement and honored to be able to play some role in helping to bring Hartman and Hartman learning to our community here. I worked in the worlds of academia and advocacy and policymaking prior to Hartman, and I'm really thrilled to take those experiences and combine them in this exciting work that brings together thought and learning and community building. First-rate thought leadership and lived Jewish communal life in a true sense, and all in service of a stronger future together. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Hartman Institute, brief overview: we are a think tank and educational organization based in Israel and North America. Our mission is to strengthen Jewish peoplehood, identity, and pluralism, to enhance the Jewish and democratic character of Israel, and to ensure that Judaism is a compelling force for good in the 21st century. A very inspiring mission to me. Part of the way we do this work, Hartman scholars and research teams study these big questions and topics facing our community, and then share that Hartman Torah, as we often call it, in a variety of ways with a range of audiences. But we have learned that in order to impact Jewish communities as and where they exist, we need to establish physical presences in those communities around the country. We've had offices prior to this in the San Francisco Bay Area, in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Canada, and Detroit, and this year Chicago and Boston are joining those offices. Here in Chicagoland, a few brief remarks about what we see the landscape we're approaching is. Our local community faces various challenges as the landscape of American Judaism at large changes and in many ways innovates, and as our personal and communal relationship to a shared past and present also evolve. So we've been conducting a listening tour of Jewish community leaders of all sorts around the Chicago area in the last few months, something we'll be continuing. And one thing that has become clear already is that it's often difficult for people to find the time, the space, and the opportunity to connect with other leaders from other parts of the community, other groups, other silos, to consider, to study, and discuss the big questions facing us today. So we hope to bring all of that Hartman experience and Hartman expertise to bear to make that kind of rich community building possible here. The Hartman Institute is here in the area to offer support to help make the Jewish community stronger and to bring together those distinct parts into a vital whole. And all of you here are the core of that base that we'll do this work from. So thank you for helping all of you to help us accomplish this crucial work and for being here this evening. And it may not be clear spread out across the room and some people masked, but this is a very diverse group. We have Jewish professionals, we have rabbis, we have other lay leaders, we have diplomats and other interfaith and intergroup partners, and those are all of the essential pieces for what we need to do this work. Now, Rabbi Siegel will speak for a few minutes. Rabbi Siegel is an alumnus of Hartman's Rabbinic Leadership Program, and he has generally offered this beautiful sanctuary and very special stained glass for us tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. Welcome to Anshe Emet. Welcome to Temple Shalom. Welcome to Anshe Shalom. It's a pleasure to greet you on behalf of the congregations in Lakeview for this very special event and what is a Shechianu moment for Chicago. I want to share my own Hartman story. And anybody who has been engaged with Hartman has their very own story as well, but here's mine. In the late 80s, as a young rabbi, I began spending time at the Hartman Institute, which was on Rachel Imenu Street in Yerushalayim, in a beautiful old tiled home. I came to learn with Rabbi David Hartman, Zichrono Livracha. I had read his books, and I loved his passion and the creativity of his thought. What I couldn't have known at the time was the impact that Rabbi Hartman and the Hartman Institute would have on my rabbinate, and by extension, this congregation. As it happened, Rabbi Hartman came to the University of Chicago to teach for a semester. So I was excited and I went to hear his lecture, and I went up to him at the end of the lecture and I re-engaged, and he said, "Can you take me to my apartment?" Which I did. And that began a semester of chauffeuring David Hartman. And I want to say that I learned a lot of Torah driving with Rabbi Hartman. There was never a moment when there was dead air in the car. Rabbi Hartman was always teaching, and I remember him standing on this bima many times, sharing his Torah with us. I was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and there I learned to study a text, to examine a text historically and critically. From David Hartman, I learned to engage a text, not just with my mind, but with my senses. For David, you could taste the ideas, you could smell their meaning. And the excitement of study with Rabbi David Hartman was palpable. And the thinking of the rabbis, ancient and modern, went from feeling relevance to being imbued with a deep sense of urgency. What a gift it was then. What a gift it is now. It's a blessing that Rabbi Conover and Rabbi Wolkenfeld understand well, and many of the rabbis who are Hartman Fellows in this room appreciate. For me, the Machon represented a place of hope in the Jewish world. Every summer, rabbis from all over the world come together and learn with some of the most brilliant minds in the Jewish world. And it would be difficult not to feel hopeful about the Jewish future when you walk into a room with men and women of every Jewish stripe sitting, learning, talking with each other with deep respect and a love of Torah that unites us all. The vision of Rabbi David Hartman is alive and well, and the Jewish future is better for it. What a gift it has been for this congregation. We were early subscribers to the iEngage program, and here at Anshe Emet, we have been able to talk about Israel on a higher plane through text, through Jewish values, and as a result, we are a stronger and more respectful community because of the Torah of the Hartman Institute. Rabbi Daniel Hartman and all those attached to the Hartman Institute have kept that tradition alive and shared it in remarkably creative ways. We couldn't be happier that Hartman is putting down stakes in Chicago. We're thrilled to work with Jason Rosenzweig and Natalie DeBow. But what begins here tonight is a tribute to the vision of Rabbi Yehuda Kurtzer. And he deserves a round of applause because Yehuda has worked tirelessly to bring the Torah of Hartman to North America. So a round of applause for Rabbi Kurtzer. And since we're talking about Yehuda, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He is a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, on Jewish history and Jewish memory, and on questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. He is the author of Shuvah, The Future of the Jewish Past, which offers new thinking to contemporary Jews on navigating the tensions between history and memory. And he is the co-editor of the New Jewish Canon, along with Claire Soufrin, who is no stranger to this community. It's a collection of the most significant Jewish ideas and debates of the past 2 generations. Yehuda is also the host of the Hartman's Identity Crisis podcast, which I recommend to you. With no further ado, Rabbi Yehuda Kurtzer.
So thank you, Rabbi Siegel, for that kind introduction and in many ways a reminder of, in reminding us about Rabbi David Hartman, a kind of challenge to what this institution has always sought to be. I loved the reference to being at Hartman and the learning together with Jews of all backgrounds, all denominations, Haredi Jews, the secular Jews, and anyone in between, although I don't think that's really the spectrum. That's expanded in so much of our work over the last 2 decades to say it's not merely a question of how do we as Jews talk to one another, it's how do we create a very different type of conversation between Jews and Christians and Muslims. It's expanded for my colleagues in Israel to ask how do we create a different values conversation between Israelis and Palestinians. All of that learning is really the legacy of this work. And we believe, and I believe it about the work that we could do here, that learning is not merely an activity, that to get together and study is not an extracurricular activity that Jews might do together with other hobbies, but that for the Jewish people, we know that the study of Torah is a world-changing outcome. We're here tonight to learn together and to start being and modeling a Jewish community that can talk across difference. So I want to do that tonight, and I want to talk specifically about what it means to engage across difference. I'll say one other thing about our work at the Hartman Institute, or about our identity as an institution, as part of introducing what I want to say tonight, which is, we have a lot of things in our mission statement. It's like an institute that likes semicolons. But I like to summarize our commitments in the world as an institution to basically 3. A belief in Jewish peoplehood, that there is something called the Jewish people, that it exists in the world and it has to be cultivated. That a belief in pluralism, the capacity to actually both epistemologically and practically figure out how to live together with other people, and a commitment to the moral, spiritual, intellectual character of the Jewish people. That's its own major commitment. The truth is, it's hard to hold on to all 3 at all times, right? If you're engaging in the question of pluralism, well, that can lead to making space for a lot of different type of moral commitments, right? But how do I actually hold myself accountable to one serious one? It's easy to kind of think about the relationship between peoplehood and pluralism, although as we'll explore tonight, peoplehood sometimes has national elements that comes with it, collective elements, and those are the things that it's most difficult for us to be in pluralistic relationship with one another about. It's hard to hold all 3 at once, and part of the seriousness of our institution and the work that we want to try to do is to be a vehicle that through study and through learning holds our community accountable to acknowledge that those are all serious commitments that should be held, and to work on what happens when those commitments are actually in tension with one another. How do we prioritize between them? Tonight I want to talk about what it means to create community across difference. The title of tonight's talk is, What Do We Mean by a Big Tent? As I'll explore, that's a term, the big tent is a term that the Jewish community has oftentimes ascribed to itself, but as I'll try to push on tonight, is not always something that has been actually true. It may be an aspiration that the Jewish community has had for itself, but it doesn't always carry into itself the values of what that would actually look like. There were times in the American, and by the way, this whole conversation, what does it mean to create community, and what does it mean to create a big tent, could be an equally plausible talk tonight about, I don't know, America, It could be an equally plausible talk in any version of smaller community that you actually would construct anywhere else around the country. Tonight, I invite you to think either in the broadest sense, what does it mean to have a Jewish community? Or to think more narrowly, what does it mean to construct a particular Jewish community? Or somewhere in between, which is, what does it look like to construct a Jewish community that we call Chicago or Chicagoland? You'll tell me when I get it right and when I get it wrong. There were times in the American Jewish story when it was easier to understand the ways in which those commitments, peoplehood, pluralism, moral character, a sense of purpose, reinforced one another. And I think we are seeing all of the ways in which those commitments today are actually pulling against one another. And I want to unpack a little bit of that phenomenon. And part of the challenge of talking about the notion of Jewish community, or a Jewish community, is that the very idea of Jewish collective identity, the notion that we belong to something bigger, that we belong to a collective, is born in a kind of paradoxical state. The earliest ideas we have about Jewish peoplehood, by the way, come not from us. The first character who describes the Jewish people as a people is Pharaoh. The Jewish people are oftentimes easier seen as a collective by people outside the Jewish people than we are inside the Jewish community. We see difference where oftentimes others see similarity or homogeneity. And at the same time that we have this notion of a collective, that we belong to a people, at the same exact time, we are born into a story that says that it is a people that is made up of tribes. One of the essential paradoxes of Jewish collectivity is that we see ourselves as both a people made up of sub-tribes and subgroups. Those ideas are going to be constantly at war with one another. To what extent do we really belong to something, as I like to think of this as the original version of a trans-historical, trans-denominational, trans-geographic, trans-racial people, a radical idea in human history, that we could belong to a people that is not broken apart by all of those commitments, and at the same time that we're meant to value our different tribal identities as being really significant. In antiquity, maybe it was tribes. In the first century, maybe it was what were called sects. In the 19th century, maybe it was denominations. In the 21st century, we have other constellations, other ways in which our tribalism is expressed. In fact, it's wonderful to have 3 different synagogues bringing their populations and their rabbis showing up together tonight. But at the end of tonight, you're all going to go back to your synagogues, and you should. And it is okay, right, for Jews to say, this is the shul I daven in, this is the one I belong to, and that's the one I don't. That's okay, right? So there's no vision for community or collectivity that's supposed to erase those differences between us. In fact, sometimes you might argue that the idea of Jewish collectivity, the idea of Jewish community, the idea of Jewish peoplehood has always been more powerful than actual Jewish community or actual Jewish collectivity or actual Jewish peoplehood. It has always been an idea or maybe an ideal that the Jewish people have used in reference to ourselves, right? That has never really carried out itself into real, like the real kind of stuff that would create a collectivity that was empirically true in reality. However, there are 3 forces at work that can sometimes make the experience of trying to create community or create collectivity work better than at other times. I would say the 3 are external forces. If you live in a time of tremendous anti-Semitism, which thank God, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in America today, but what we experience is of a different category and caliber than what almost every diaspora Jewish community has experienced. External forces create a consolidation among communities that is better than we could do on our own. Good news, bad news. When they don't let you into their clubs, you have to create clubs of your own that create that kind of collectivity. Sometimes historical urgencies, right, create the necessity or the opportunity to do something powerful and profound. There's all sorts of reasons why, following World War II, following the Holocaust, the Jewish community developed an idea of Jewish peoplehood, developed an idea of Jewish collectivity. The term peoplehood itself was made up. It's a weird word. I follow the scholar Noam Pianko, who argues that peoplehood came from a desire not really to use the term nationalism to describe what Jews were about, because that would make American Jews queasy in the middle of the 20th century. It invites the specter of dual loyalty. So instead of thinking about ourselves using the term of nationalism, I have a safer word, which is peoplehood. There's all sorts of historical reasons why American Jews gravitate towards the story of Jewish collectivity, towards the story of Jewish peoplehood that is prompted by a unique historical moment and unique historical circumstances. And then there are oftentimes also moments of purpose. So if you listen to Identity Crisis, you've heard me now on this soapbox about this, but I'm totally fascinated by the fact that in 1946, the United Jewish Appeal set out as its goal to raise what would be the equivalent in 2022 of $1.5 billion in a single campaign year. And they got laughed and they got mocked, and they met the target within 3 months. Because liberation of Auschwitz had taken place months earlier, and the State of Israel was on the precipice of being built. When you have a particular purpose, a sense of clear purpose, you can create enough togetherness around those commitments, peoplehood, collective identity, pluralism, we're going to have to figure out some technology of getting along, and a sense of purpose that we are building something committed, that we are all committed to, something that is transcended, that is unique. Needless to say, the moment we're living in now, in the American Jewish community, doesn't really have those three forces. We are not rendered one community or collective based on external forces. We are not obligated, right, to belong to the Jewish community because you can't belong elsewhere. The American Jewish community is, for better or worse, a community of radical choice. You can opt in or you can opt out. And even those who would claim that Jewish identity is somehow stuck with us, it's inseparable from us, does not force anybody to actually belong to the community or belong to a collective. The idea that there are historical urgencies actually is kind of pulling in the other direction. Historical urgencies right now are not coalescing Jews to say, we need to be committed together to the same shared enterprise. They actually feel like they're moving us into different directions. American Jews, as Americans, are engaged with really deep existential questions about America, for which having to figure out a consensus American Jewish position about those things is a huge obstacle. It might actually get in the way of doing serious work around the repair of America. And I would argue that we lack a common North Star objective. Like, what would be the thing that you would say, this year's annual campaign for the Jewish community is going to raise $1.5 billion? Incredibly, right? Just this week, they announced, after tremendous work, and it's an incredible accomplishment, the Jewish community, organized Jewish community, raised their fund to support, I think, primarily Jews in the Ukraine, and they raised $60 million. That's extraordinary. Truly extraordinary by objective standards. But in comparison to the ability in a particular moment to raise $1.5 billion, it's a different game altogether. And of course, money and fundraising are not the only indicator of what it means to do collective work. But it does appear as though our ability to imagine some sort of collective story of belonging has dissipated for all these historical reasons. Now, one of the questions is, what's lost? One of the wonderful things that happens is that maybe sometimes the story of Jewish history is there are times when we are a people, and there are times when we are tribes, times when we are sects or denominations. And there's something wonderful about that. Individual, particular Jewish identities can thrive in a moment like this. Sometimes when a group imagines that we are all part of some shared collective, you know who loses a lot in that story? Individuals. People who don't feel that they fully fit in with the ethos that the community is describing as being shared and collective. So there is opportunity for individual Judaisms and even tribal Judaisms to thrive in a moment like this. But I do wonder whether there are some things that are lost. Our capacity to collectively organize is something that is threatened by the inability to describe ourselves as one community. If there would be an existential threat to Jews in America, would we be able to actually re-aggregate to combat them? And I'm nervous that I'm not sure there would be. There's good evidence that I'm not sure there is, in that anti-Semitism has become partisanized. Anti-Semitism should be the last holdout that all Jews agree is bad. But if you're basically fighting only the anti-Semites who you see as associated with the other political party, you're not really fighting anti-Semitism, you're trying to win elections. So that is that's like an example of, it's not clear to me that we could do anything that involves real collective organizing. Also, what might be lost is the question of belonging. If we redefine Jewish belonging as belonging to particular Jewish communities as opposed to collective Jewish communities, that simply is a shift in Jewish history. It's a shift in the meaning of Judaism. And I wonder that one of the things that is harder and harder for us to grasp is just that big story. What does it mean to belong to the Jewish people? What does it mean to think of ourselves as belonging to the Chicago Jewish community? It's really easy for many individuals, and maybe a lot of those individuals are not here tonight. Maybe a lot of the folks who self-select into a lecture in a synagogue I think this is a Wednesday, on a Wednesday, are the types of people who already belong to a particular institution, and through that see themselves as belonging to something larger. But it's much easier for folks to self-identify into a particular Judaism than it is to see themselves as belonging to some much larger collective. So tonight, this is the question that I want to explore. As usual, I'm going to offer better questions than I offer answers. But I want to do that learning together with you and then invite the three rabbis on the stage so we can talk through not just what these ideas reflect in the larger sense, but what it actually might mean to envision community together in a particular Jewish community. I want to start by sharing two images of community. One is an image of Jewish community from a text that imagines a tent. I want to go back to that terminology of big tent. I love that term. By the way, what kind of tent do you imagine when you think of big tent? There's a lot of different implications to it. Some people go to, like, carnival. Carnivals are interesting because they're closed. The tent I want to think with tonight is, stay with me on this, graduation tent. You know what graduation tent is? It's the one that has outdoor davening tent, right? A wall-less tent. So the first image I want to give to you tonight is the image of what do we mean by a big tent. Let's look at one text in Jewish tradition that thinks of that uses the language that describes the idea of a tent. It's a Mishnah. It's a rabbinic text from Avoti Rabbi Natan, which is a kind of a rabbinic commentary on a Mishnah, on a early rabbinic text. And it's riffing off of one of the ideas or values that is advanced by one of the earlier rabbis: let your home be open to all, or let your home be wide open. I'll tell you, when I started doing this work for this, I grew up with the image that the archetypical Jew who had a home, a tent that was open on all sides was who? Abraham. The earliest version of this text does not use Abraham as the archetypical Jew whose tent is open on all sides, but Job. We can figure that out. That's like wild and interesting for its own. That's its own 2 hours. We're not going to do that tonight. I'm just taking the text kind of as metaphor. So let your house be open on all sides. How so? This teaches that a person's house should be open on all sides, right? Literally on all sides. Not like you're hospitable and welcoming, but it literally should be open on all sides, the south, the west, the east, and the north, like Job, who made 4 doors to his house. And why did he make 4 doors to his house? I think this is really instructive, so that the poor would not have to trouble themselves to go around the whole house. With Abraham, when these texts evolved to describe Abraham, it's about hospitality. With Job, it's more than that. It's more than hospitality. It's actually, someone is coming to ask you for money, they should have direct access to come directly into your house. Someone who came from the north or in that direction, etc., that's why Job made 4 doors to his house. So one story that I think the Jewish community has liked to use with respect to itself is the story of the big tent. Let's talk about its strengths and its limitations. On one hand, there's a beautiful idea around hospitality that suggests that yes, there is a home, there is a house, but it is genuinely and fundamentally open. Incidentally, anyone who has felt marginal or marginalized by the Jewish community would not report this. It's not genuinely open. There are visible and invisible obstacles constantly. But even as a metaphor or as an ideal, there's also something that's tricky that's baked into this, which is it's not a tent that is jointly inhabited by everybody in the neighborhood. There's an owner, a proprietor, and other people who want to enter have to enter. And it's a beautiful idea to say it should be open on all sides, but it fundamentally leaves the category of inclusion as something that is owned by people on the inside as a moral responsibility and has to be pursued or sought after by people who are on the outside. We like this terminology of big tent, even though some of the metaphors that big tent already imply is that there are some people who are already kind of inside the tent, and there are other people who are outside the tent. Nevertheless, what I think we imply when we think about the Jewish community as a tent is something like this. Not a carnival tent that's closed, but a graduation tent, a outdoor davening tent that is actually accessible, that people should be able to come in and participate on whatever's taking place inside. Now I want to present a different template of community that can be found in a different rabbinic text, and I want to explore what are the different ramifications of a different model of community. I've been spending a lot of time on this text over the last couple of years thinking about the whole question of obligation and responsibility in America, and here's a different story. So this is the second text that's on your handout. The residents of a courtyard can compel each inhabitant of that courtyard to financially participate in the building of a gatehouse and the door to the courtyard. If you live in a gated community, right, you can compel other residents of that community to contribute the costs of the gatehouse and the door. Why? Any guesses? So since you share it, therefore, great. Since you're all sharing this space, right, that creates coercive possibilities for me to say, you have to share in these costs. Since you share the benefits, you have to share the cost. In other words, the assumption of the construct of community is that it is something that it's not just open on all sides, but I haven't really told you what's there. Right? The assumption is that community provides some notion, some sense of security to everyone who's on the inside, and therefore, like the first activity that you can do together with someone who comes in, it's not that you're supposed to be inhospitable. I don't think this text, as juxtaposed to the other one, is to suggest you're not supposed to be hospitable. But the main idea that this text is trying to convey is that you want to belong to a community, you have to pay membership. Synagogues sometimes get mocked for this, right? The first thing you get when you walk into a building is a membership application. Most of our synagogues have recognized that that's not ideal, right? But there is already baked in, and legitimately, some recognition, I would say in the positive sense, of like, these are the people who hold this place up. We want you here. We don't want you here just to materially support this work. We want you to be part of this community, and ultimately we entirely depend on the participants to constitute or make up this group. There's a debate about whether all courtyards require gatehouse, but we'll look at the last line of the text here. The Mishnah asks, how long does a person have to live in the city to be considered like a person of the city? And the rabbis answer, right, 12 months. You don't get the membership application until you're there for a year, a full cycle. Right? However, if he buys a residence in the town, he's immediately considered like a person of the city. Right? So now, this text also imagines that there's a transition, a process where people might come into a community. But when we envision people coming into a community, it's less we are being hospitable to them, it's more they have a grace period. The thing that's honest about this text as a paradigm for community is that it recognizes that the transactions that take place in the tent or in the structure are actually existentially significant for the institution itself. We are ultimately made up of those who come in, stay, and help to support and sustain this infrastructure. I would argue that actually the way the American Jewish community is designed is that it imagines itself largely as a big tent, but operates itself much more as a gated community. right? We want to think of ourselves as a big tent because that conveys values of openness. It conveys a carnival atmosphere. All this interesting stuff is going on in there. But the fluidity that would be implied by a big tent is belied by most of our needs as a Jewish community. If everybody was able to kind of freely come and go in Jewish communal life, would anybody pay the bills? If everybody was a free agent coming in and out of a tent that was open on all four sides, would we feel as though there was anything there to hold it up? So that anxiety about both of those things, right, both of those concerns, a desire to be genuinely open and welcoming, is also counterweighted by serious material and economic concerns. But there's a second force that's at work here, and here I just want to make sure that, to be clear, that this wasn't a bait and switch. I did use the word Israel in the title of what I was going to talk about here. The big questions that we have as a Jewish community around the construct of community are not just around the material questions, like who's supposed to hold this up and who's supposed to sustain it, but what is the makeup? What are the commitments that constitute a big tent Jewish community? And here too, the notion that we are a Jewish community that is committed to a certain set of ideas, ideals, right? Big, lofty commitments like the State of Israel, but operates like a big tent, would suggest that there's tremendous fluidity, tremendous openness on those commitments, and that they're just constantly being negotiated and renegotiated at all times. More seriously, and acknowledging that in many ways commitment to Israel and Jewish peoplehood were part of the stuff that actually helped make the Jewish community thrive starting in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, that they created a sense of collectivity and Jewish peoplehood. The more common experience is that around issues like collectivity itself, around Israel and around anti-Semitism, we certainly operate a lot more like a gated community, where the tax that is paid is not financial, but ideological. In order to participate, to belong to this community, here are the set of commitments that you have to hold. And if you're actually taking up significant real estate in this community, your obligations around those ideological commitments kick in right away. We may allow you to hover on the boundaries of community for a metaphorical or a literal 12 months. But if you're going to actually be part of this, if you're going to be part of the infrastructure, there are going to be ideological consequences. So that's idea number one. Idea number two, that I've been thinking a lot about, okay, so let's say you wanted to reinvestigate. What does it mean to build community? What are the things that you might want to undertake for us as an American Jewish community, where community is not something that we take for granted anymore, where collective belonging is not something we take for granted anymore? What might be the strategies that you would engage with in building community? So I have built, I think, a terrible chart. I'm very proud of my poor design skills. I even had to delegate this, and this is what we have. It strikes me that there are essentially two ways to build community, or to build solidarity. There's a set of strategies on this spectrum, which we'd call constructive strategies, that assume that what I'm trying to do is to build something together with whomever can show up. The stuff that you would do if you were keeping a tent that was open on all sides. The things you might do would be convening. Convening is a really beautiful and powerful way to build community because it doesn't get tied into like clear outcomes. I want to just bring, how many we are? 120 Jews from across, and non-Jews, from across Chicago to do some learning together. You don't have to sign a form at the end, right? I agree on the shared statement. You don't have to make a financial commitment. We are convening. We are creating community. It's light in the sense that our sense of obligations towards one another are very weak, right? It doesn't create strong ties. But over time, you could imagine that a process of convening actually constituted a community of people who would gradually want to move towards the darker blue by doing things like essentializing. We've been meeting together and davening together, praying together, studying together for a while, for the last 2 years. Let's come up with some core principles. Let's come up with a mission statement. Let's come up with a set of rules, a set of norms. That is a stronger, right, a stronger mechanism to create community where it wasn't before. There's another impulse around creating community, which I want to call protective methods. In those moments, you already know who your stakeholders are. You are committed to a set of people, right? You hold on to them, and what you're inclined to do is protect that community of people against external threats. Those types of activities tend to be much less open, light blue. They tend to be the types of things that are involved with advocating or legislating or litigating, making rules, establishing norms. See, one of the ironies, I think, of what's going on in American Jewish life today is that we have more and more anxiety about the diminishing ties that American Jews have to community, but we are responding to that collectively with protective methodologies. It's backwards. It's when you have a community that's actually tight-knit and you're nervous about people leaving or you're nervous about heresies. If you already have a tight-knit community, you might deploy those protective methodologies. If you actually were looking at this moment empirically and saying a sense of Jewish community is eroding among American Jews, you might have to invest in a totally different set of strategies to actually make belonging once again possible. Now, I know why that makes people anxious. You see all the reasons. If you hold to strong beliefs and strong commitments, then you create a sense of vulnerability to yourself when you say, no, I just want to be a convener. I want to bring people in. Right? If you hold to strong commitments, you want to make sure that you protect the gated community. You want to make sure that that's actually protected against interlopers and outsiders. You may not want to yield on the severity or the seriousness of those commitments. They are core to who you are and what you do. Nevertheless, I'm increasingly feeling like it's impossible to do both of these things, to hold on to a tight-knit sense of community and to imagine the ways that that's actually going to expand to make possible more and more entry or claiming into a Jewish community that can only really happen through what I would call constructive methods. So the third idea, and this, and I'll end with this and invite our rabbis to come join me in conversation, is okay. So let's say the challenge that we have is to try to figure out, let's say you're with me tonight, and you say, we want to figure out how to make a Jewish community possible that genuinely feels more tent-like than gated community. Let's say that was our goal, and that people felt there was access into Jewish communities, small scale, lowercase c and uppercase c. There was points of access, that people wanted more Jews to come in and participate, that we were less anxious ideologically about what would happen if more people participate. That's like the great irony of the American Jewish moment. We want more people to feel part of this. We're really anxious that they're going to come with their full selves. It's a powerful and a little bit of a sad irony, right? What's going to happen as the core values, the makeup of this thing, when everybody's actually allowed to be there and be full stakeholders? What would that look like? And it strikes me that there's a few things that you'd want to put in place to be what would be the way in which a big tent would really be what it is supposed to be. I keep going back to this text. Jewish tradition tells a story that its rabbinic tradition was founded at Yavne. The story that Jewish tradition tells about Yavne is actually kind of a bad one. It's in the sense that there's corruption in Jerusalem, and rabbis escape the corruption to create like their own version of an ideal story that's separated from the Jewish people. It's not a great Jewish peoplehood story, right? It's actually kind of a tribal story. I'm fascinated by a different myth of origin for the rabbinic tradition, which appears in Song of Songs Rabbah, which describes a moment of persecution 60 years roughly after the destruction of the temple in Usha in the Galilee. And this is like a different vision of what the prompting moment to create the rabbinic tradition was. And it says as follows. At the end of the persecution, our rabbis gathered in Yavne, in Usha, and these were they, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemiah, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi. They sent to the house of the elders of the Galilee and said, they gather together, they do that first act, which is convening, and then they send out a message. Anyone who's already studied, let them come and teach. And anyone who has not yet studied, let them come and study. Essentially an open invitation to anyone who wants to be part of whatever it is we're doing here. Some of you are going to come already with wisdom and knowledge. We're going to give you the pride of place to be educators. You already know something. We need to constitute this community on the basis of commitments. We need knowledgeable people. And if you're not among the knowledgeable, you're equally invited to be part of this, but you're at this point in a learning role as opposed to a teaching role. And then there's this incredible last line. They gathered together and they studied. Notice, by the way, it doesn't say some of them taught and some of them learned. Once you actually put a lot of people together in the room, what emerges is shared study. The hierarchies break down. And then this beautiful last line, and they took care of all of their needs. Asu kol tzarcheihem. That model was able to constitute a community. So what are the values of this kind of big tent? So one value is there's got to be something going on in it. The thing that makes me craziest about the metaphors of big tent that we use in the Jewish community is that we want there to be a big tent, but oftentimes people don't find enough content in the community activities that big tent are supposed to convey. It's got to be a fire burning at the center. I'm inclined to believe, based on watching which institutions, which synagogues are thriving and growing in Jewish life, is that less anxiety about who's not there and more focus on making something great here actually solves both problems. People are drawn to warmth. They're drawn to fire. There's something powerful going on in Usha, and they know that it can be, and they want more people to be part of the fire that's burning at the core. A serious big tent is going to have a serious activity going on in its midst. The second is, you have to actually be serious about being open on all sides. If you want to claim the terminology of big tent, and maybe somebody might come away from this tonight saying, the lesson is, let's stop talking about the big tent. That's a fine conclusion. But if we're serious about it, what would that actually look like in Jewish communal life? To be really serious about the notion of big tent, that we are genuinely willing to interrogate our own biases and assumptions about what the right Jewish identity, belief, and politics are, because we think that it's really important for us to be a collective in spite of those differences. We'd have to be serious about it. Now, by the way, those first thing and the second one are usefully in tension with one another. If you have something powerful going on in the Jewish community, I'm less nervous about who you are walking in. I'm more enthusiastic to figure out whether you can contribute to what's actually taking place in our work together. The third, which is connected, is you have to be really careful about what are the boundaries. Really very few boundaries. Maybe the boundaries are the tent itself. Want to be part of this? Great. If not, not. But I just feel so frequently in Jewish life that before we talk about what's taking place in Jewish life, we are stipulating the boundaries. We're constantly in the business of stipulating the boundaries. We've got to be much more careful about that enterprise. And I guess the last piece, because there is always going to be a point at which any sort of open tent, any vision of community is going to have to know what it actually has to push against. I guess I would love to see a Jewish community that was fighting only against those who you really thought were sabotaging the tent. Which is different from, there are a lot of people in this community who have really different opinions about Jewish life versus actively trying to dismantle a sense of Jewish collectivity, Jewish community, and Jewish belonging. Tents, communities, are allowed to feel, right? They're allowed to act as though they have independent integrity and autonomy. They're allowed to push against threats that come their way. But I think that the big difference would be that instead of being constantly anxious about the stuff that took place before people were coming in, we focused a lot more on just resisting those who were trying to dismantle that project of collectivity itself. Any secure notion, any amount, that whole dance on how open and how closed we are is going to depend most of all on whether it feels like there is a transformative thing taking place here in Jewish life that people want to be a part of. I started tonight by talking a little bit about the historical reasons why community and collectivity were a little easier at earlier points in American Jewish history. To notice that to argue for community and collectivity, to argue for the notion of a big tent, is to do something today that was fueled by history and now actually feels countercultural. I wanted to acknowledge in doing that to argue for a notion of the Jewish people, or to argue for a notion of a Jewish community, that I know I'm pushing against a very healthy tribal impulse. That's a dance. That's okay. It's just to argue that you have to be part of the collective and not part of your own group would miss something very important. To notice that we just don't have those same shortcuts of politics and history that we once had that make the project of Jewish community as doable today as it was before. So if that's the case, I wanted to suggest, using some of these metaphors, that we first have to pick the metaphor we want. What do we want to be? Do we want to be a tent, which I would argue is better than a gated community? Do we actually want to be that? And if so, what would be the methodologies around the building of community and solidarity that we would want to engage with? Can we check, can we notice our instinct towards protective solidarity, also born of anxiety? Can we notice why that's there, and also figure out how do we push against it? And can we start to articulate, if we're genuinely committed to a notion of a big tent, what that actually has to consist of? I want to conclude by saying this. I started off by talking about pluralism, peoplehood, and the moral character of the Jewish people. I talk a lot about peoplehood and pluralism, because I think that they're important. They're like, on the decline, and they're really important and powerful and world-changing Jewish ideas. It is not because I don't have very, very strong opinions about the moral character of the Jewish people. It is not because I have some diminished interest in Israel as an essential feature of what I think an American Jewish identity should be. It's not because I don't have an opinion about which shuls I want to daven in and which I will not daven in. I have really strong opinions about that. But in order to be able to have a conversation on peoplehood and pluralism, we have to figure out a way to both hold on to our commitments and really test them by creating metaphors, models, and even moral possibilities for us to say, what does it look like for us to suspend that in order to try to build some notion of a big tent that is going to do something transformative and essential for American Jews. Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to invite Rabbi Conover, Rabbi Siegel, and Rabbi Wolkenfeld up here.
Okay, thank you so much, Yehuda, for such a stimulating set of ideas. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around to listen to my response and our responses in our discussion. I was first reminded of an essay that our teacher, Lichtenstein, wrote about tolerance and tents, and he wrote about that tents can be large, and they can also be two variables when you're thinking about tents. There's how large the tent is, and then there's how open, or what's your relationship to those outside the tent. And I just thinking about my own life and various issues over the years, there are issues where I felt really, really comfortable with a big tent, come inside, maybe I'm right, maybe you're right, we'll just hang out in the tent and talk about it, and that's great. There are other issues where I felt, I'm pretty sure that I'm not in the same tent as you, but I'm totally happy waving at you outside the tent and smiling. We can pass you a hot dog outside the tent, and that can be great, but it's very clear that I'm inside and you're outside, okay? And I think it's helpful when thinking about tolerance and pluralism. There's how big is the tent, and then what's our relationship to those outside the tent, and when do we bring down the rain aside of when the weather's bad. And I think maybe the answer of when we bring down the walls is when we actually perceive an actual, immediate, very, very concrete sense of danger. In the 20th century, the Chazon Ish, who was one of the founding fathers of Haredi Judaism and kind of paved the way for Haredi participation in modern Israeli life, writes that even though the Talmud and classical sources say that we should try as best we can to kill heretics, we don't do that anymore because, he writes, it doesn't seem to work, right? It's somehow, right, when we kill the heretics, God doesn't, stop plagues and stop bad things from happening to us. So it doesn't seem to keep our community safe. okay, the world is different now. God's treating us in a different way, so let's not shove them into the pits anymore. And I think what's happened, I think there are a set of issues where we really actually do feel that the heretics are hurting us in one way or the other, right? I think there are people I know in Israel or very much invested in the safety of Israel and Israelis who feel that harsh criticism of Israel by people in America actually puts Israeli lives at risk, that our discourse can have a ripple effect on the diplomatic support the state of Israel has, and lives are put in danger by the things that we say. And on the other side, there are critics of Israel who feel that our discourse is empowering and enabling a great evil being perpetrated by the state of Israel on a daily, ongoing basis, and there's like concrete harm from the way we talk and act. And I think around issues like that, it's really hard to be tolerant and pluralistic and inclusive. And I think like in American politics over the last, I think for that, what I've seen amongst my circle of friends in the last 5-6 years is like the moral valence of American political debates has really been heightened. And it's much harder to like kind of tolerate these opinions that we feel are actually causing real harm. So like an aphorism that I've observed, like I've said, I think everybody is orthodox about something. It's just a question of what you're orthodox about. And everyone wants a safe space, okay, somewhere. They want a place where they don't have to have their guard up. They don't have to debate about everything. They can just feel like themselves and relax and sort of exhale. I think maybe some of the challenges about what's happening on college campuses is that universities are both sites of debate and discussion. They're also literally the homes of students where they like want to feel at home and comfortable. So that's like a challenge. So like just briefly, like maybe an idea of like some possible way, a model of things that, like another metaphor, throw some other metaphors out. One is the metaphor of the sukkah, okay? Rav Shagar, who's died some years ago, a postmodern Israeli thinker and rabbi, writes about the sukkah as a hut, a structure that on the one hand, it celebrates the agricultural cycle of the land of Israel. It's rooted in a particular spot, but it also commemorates our homelessness and our wandering through the desert. So it's like a paradoxical structure, and it enables hospitality. Hospitality keeps that hierarchy of host and guest, but it gives a moral obligation on the host to invite the guest. And maybe that's a way we can, there's certain commitments we have, there are things we believe in, and we're not going to necessarily compromise that on every single issue, but we're going to be hospitable and we're going to invite others. And then one other metaphor, another moment of metaphor, is before Yom Kippur, when we declare in synagogues, the Beit Din below, the Beit Din above, we are going to pray alongside sinners. And we don't specify at that moment what the sinners are. There could be political sinners, there could be religious sinners, there could be economic sinners, but we're all going to pray together. So we're acknowledging that the people beside us are sinful. They're saying that about us too, and we kind of recognize that. We sort of recognize we have a mutual condemnation of one another in various ways, but we can identify certain actions that we can do together, and maybe prayer, let's say, hoping for good things, right? We can hope for good things even if we have very different opinions about what's wrong and how to get those good things. So thank you for...
Go. Do you want to go next? Okay. Yehuda, thank you. First of all, I want to say that I believe big tents are possible. I think that each of our congregations represent a different version of a big tent. And I also believe that what makes that possible is that it's not simply the opening on all sides, but it also, each of the congregations allows for different places within the congregation for smaller groups to gather. There's no one size fits all. But as you were talking, I was really thinking about what would be destructive? What would be so destructive that I wouldn't want to allow that force in? And I've been sort of thinking about it over and over, and so thank you for the stimulation to really think hard on things. And what I came up with was, first of all, the word that, there are two words in our names of our congregations that are not shared. So you have Anshe Shalom, you have Anshe Emet, and Temple Shalom. So Anshe Shalom gets both of them. The words that are not shared, one is temple, and I'll leave that one to you, and the other is emet, truth. So the forces outside are all about the notion of truth that is an un-Jewish understanding of truth. Truth in the Jewish sense is the Aleph, Mem, Taf, the first, middle, last letter of the alphabet. The truth is expansive. But if I think that there's one truth, that's a destructive force, and we see it not only everywhere in America, on the left and the right, but we also see it in the Jewish community in terribly destructive ways. And the other force that is destructive is fear. And our society, our American society, is all about creating fear. Every social media outlet, every cable outlet, they deal in the realm of fear. You should be afraid of this person. You should be afraid of that person. You should be afraid of that idea. Those two ideas of emet and pachad, to me, are the most destructive forces in the Jewish community. I need to fear, and that's what David was talking about. I need to fear that debate because it's going to destroy us. What happened to the idea of machloket in the Jewish community? What happened to the idea of having open, honest conversations without the notion that I own the truth or that I have to be afraid of how you understand truth? That, to me, is something that is very dangerous for all of us.
So I wanted to just pick up on, firstly, that notion of machloket l'shem shamayim, this notion of that comes in a different place in Avot, the notion that we should be able to argue as long as arguments are for the sake of heaven. And this notion is that if you argue for the sake of heaven, it says that it remains. And so then Bartenura asks, well, what is it that remains? Does it mean that the machloket, the difference, remains? And he says, no, what it means is that the community stays together even amidst difference. And I'll say that two things about that really strike me about what I find that I love about specifically this Lakeview community, and then hopefully, and also Hartman pluralism, is that you come in with an opinion. There's nothing wrong with actually saying, yeah, we have opinions, we have boundaries, and then we listen to each other, and we have arguments because we are opinionated, but then the way in which we argue means that we stay as one community. I don't want for us to have such a big tent that we forget that differences shall remain and should remain, and that's part of the beauty of this all. It was interesting because you have the text that I just want to go to for a sec. So the text from Bava Batra, and if you take this into the Gemara, there's more there, and it gets very pointed. And it was interesting that you decided not to make it this pointed because we have it that Elijah never comes around to these gated communities anymore. And Rashi then goes and asks, well, why is it that Elijah never comes to these communities anymore? And it's because they could no longer hear the voices of the poor. And I'll say that for one of the teachings from Daniel Hartman that still sticks with me from the very first time that I ever studied at Hartman is that the way that we can actually see ourselves best is that when we see others looking at us as a community, and then we actually have to see, what are we doing inside our gates? But if we no longer have those, and let's say that the poor stand in for all marginalized, that if we actually have gated communities, synagogues, that keep out people who feel on the margins or who are on the margins, if we do that, we never see ourselves. And then we have to shift again, right? Because the whole idea is then people who felt on the margins are no longer on the margins, they're within, they're then creating who then is the next who are on the margins, and so on and so forth. I think that with what I love about the last piece, so you start with big tent, and I think that for me, the concern about the big tent and everybody's welcome is that we don't then actually say what we really stand for, and also that somebody owns that tent to welcome others in. We see, obviously, the critique of synagogues that have made for themselves gated communities. But I want to take it to this last text here, which I love and I haven't been familiar with before this, so thank you. And that is, so you mentioned some of the pieces that are astounding about this, but I also love, like, what wouldn't be a great community that's founded on Rabbi Meir and Shimon Bar Yochai and these others who are building this community, right? Like, they are the best of the best. And I think that that's another thing that we should see. Who's building communities and what are they doing? How can they be playful? Well, they can be playful and open because they're coming in with so much that they've both learned and that they want to still learn. And so, and here's what I love also. You have some of the greatest of the greats of that era. You have Rabbi Yehuda, you have Rabbi Nehemiah, you have Rabbi Meir, you have Rabbi Yossi, and you have Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And you also have the sons of Yossi HaGamil. That they actually have a group of people who are saying, okay, we're looking at next generation, we're looking at people who are from the Galil, who are native to the Galil, that you're actually saying, oh my gosh, so you're not only taking the greats of the greats from before, you're saying, let me be open to what's coming tomorrow. And that, for me, is what gets so exciting about how we build community. We play based on real learning and a real love of learning, and that allows us to be more open, that allows us to see ourselves because we can see throughout the generations how we build best and how we have to build different for a future that, by the way, when we are more open, it means we can't predict what happens next, but if we're building on great sources together, well, then it's an adventure that we take together. And I think that for me, part of the counter to a fixed truth or building on fear is that we get playful, because there's what to be playful about. And so what I really appreciate about this last text is it just seems like they must be having so much fun, you know? And so I think that bringing that back into our communities and having that as, when you were saying, oh, let's care more about who's here, well, I think we need to see who's here, but also who haven't felt welcome to be here, how we welcome that by being so playful and open.
If I could just respond to that and to these other comments, one of the threads that runs through is the question a little bit about, like, less truth, more truth, acknowledging that when you say, like, watching the polarization take place of, like, people who you genuinely think are doing terrible things in the world, where it's banal to say, well, the truth claims don't enter into play here, because at a certain point those truth claims turn into politics and they change the world. Like, you have to really engage with that. I guess the philosopher Avishai Margalit, in his book on compromise, suggests that our primary orientation should always be towards compromise, except if it becomes rotten compromise. And his kind of the classic example is Neville Chamberlain, as, like, the willingness to compromise to the point that you are compromised, right? You can't get to that point. But his argument in saying that, like, one should be committed to compromise except if it's rotten compromise is not that you should then live in existential fear all the time of how any form of compromise becomes rotten compromise. It's just that you should actually push yourself all the way to the precipice and be willing to step back if it actually means going over a cliff in terms of our compromise. And that's just so difficult to do, and you see the way that what's happening in our society is actually a fear of being compromised that actually is making people prioritize safety or prioritize a fear avoidance. So any version of a real machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute for the sake of heaven, I like the language of playful, But it also is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. It's not supposed to be that real, genuine engagement in communities that can tolerate difference involves something that is always joyful or always particularly easy. It just means that you have decided to commit to it, right, as a practice and a norm, and maybe even as an ethic, even if it actually fundamentally makes you uncomfortable. And I think part of what's lost here is the art in the difference between, we can all do, like, you can do debate club in high school. That's still alive and well, right? What do communities that are big enough to tolerate difference, how do they normalize real debate? Not in the context of just Torah study, where it's like, I study, okay, we have different opinions on this text. But like, we really are a community that's willing to be resilient in holding together real, genuine difference and argument, and knowing that at a certain point, either the community has to make a decision one way or another, or people have to decide if it's too important for them to hold on to that viewpoint, they're going to have to find a different place to hang out. Like one matter of public policy, Jewish community is oftentimes, this organization puts out a statement. I've tried to argue for years, if you want to put out the statement, and by the way, generally, don't need the statement, but if you want to put out a statement, wouldn't it be powerful to put out a statement, especially if you represented a broad constituency, and published the dissent? Where you said, this is the position we held to, this was the dissent, here's how it's well articulated, and we've decided to go with this position. And because many times, people who feel disaffected by community, it's not that they disagree. People know that communities have to make rules and make norms. What they don't like is the feeling of not being heard, of being told your opinion is not just not policy, it actually can come into play. So there's somewhere here between playfulness, and I think you're right, playfulness is a part of the story, and actually habituating the norms of what real debate inside a community could look like that help you navigate, I think, this boundary between the commitment to truth and the commitment to pluralism.
Well, and I'll also say that I think that actually that when you start with seeking to understand, the notion of going to compromise, I get it, and there's a part of me that has an allergy to that.
Yep.
But that notion of seeking to understand can be very playful. Debates, humor, like those can go together in a way where we can be bringing each other out in ways that even while we fundamentally disagree about something, we can have fun being playful with it, even when it gets to the core of our identity, even if it gets to those things where we are not going to compromise, that I think we can still have that. I would go from, instead of having that attempt to compromise and always having that as our North Star, unless there's an absolute where we can't do that, it's a rotten compromise. For me, I feel like what I want to do is be curious, be curious, be curious. And I think that I would rather have that as my stance than to be ready to compromise.
So I wonder, Shoshana, whether that playfulness and that like vibrant Beit Midrash culture of not feeling a need to resolve things and just being endlessly curious about other opinions, is that dependent on the Beit Midrash emerging as a institution for people without political power, right? Because without political power, the ideas can remain ideas. They never have to be resolved, but in other aspects of our life, other facets of it, we're exercising power, and lives are at stake, and positions are being taken, things are being done. So
Right. Yeah. There's this piece where we've really lost our ability to organize. I mean, when you said that, it was absolutely. I think that that's and that's a danger. I think that's a danger for our democratic society, that we are and the values that many of us would hold most dear. That if we're unable to organize, we lose a lot. However, I wonder what it would look like for some people to organize. So, for instance, in our community, there are going to be nuances of different issues where we're going to be different, and then there are things where we really can organize and do something around. And what would it be for us for the things where there is no compromise, there's a way for them to find somewhere else to organize, and but I think that having a collective voice and using that voice to have our civics represented and our values represented in our civil life, I think is essential. So I get it. Playfulness only goes so far, and then you got to roll up your sleeves and get to work.
Can I want to challenge you about something, and I want to look at your chart again. I won't. I hope you won't be. I won't hurt your feelings. This chart is. I think it's a really interesting one. But when you put an arrow that says constructive method and protective method, that feels like a value judgment, right? If I'm too protective, in other words, I look at this chart and I say, well, this is the expanse of Jewish leadership right there. There are times when you have to make decisions that may be experienced as coercive. And unless you do that, you won't be true to your values. And so I would have preferred that the chart not have, I think strategy for building community and leaving it in one color would have been much more comfortable for me. Because the first time I read it, I said, oh no, the darker color is really problematic. And I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. And so I'd like to get your response to that.
I do not think that light blue is morally better than dark blue. So the color piece is not.
I just want to say that the light blue comes close to cubby blue.
Oh, there you
so
go.
in this neighborhood, we might actually be open to that, but not for the same reason.
No, I understand the risk of suggestion that one of these is good as one of them is bad. I think part of the reason the reason I organized this the way I did is because part of what happens is your choice of metaphor, your choice of construct of what you want your Jewish community to be is going to lean you towards is going to push you towards one of these instincts. I don't actually feel that protective methods around certain communities that I belong to are bad. In fact, I think they're unbelievably necessary, right? You have depending on the size of the community, its needs, a synagogue is going to have a different disposition around this than a JCC, a communal organization. Part of the reason I developed this actually was just recently we were doing a seminar with Muslim and Jewish leaders, and I was trying to help play out the ways in which there have been a whole bunch of somewhat controversial decisions made by Jewish organizations around American politics and Zionist politics in America. And I was trying to point out that I actually think that they're on different places as strategies of building solidarity on this chart. They look like they're the same, circling the wagons, but they actually represent different types of moves, one of which is we're going to tell you what we stand for, and we're going to support political candidates who support that view, which is a kind of advocating or essentializing view. And the other is we're going to declare a viewpoint that we consider to be anathema, and we're going to tell you that once you've held to that position, you're outside the tent. It's interesting, even within Jewish communal politics, they're not doing the same thing, and they're motivated by different visions of who they are. I will say, as a parent, I feel I run my household a little bit more in the dark blue, right? Right? So there are a whole bunch of ways in which, whatever model of community we want to put in place, we have to know, first of all, what we're hoping for, what's that vision, and then what are the tools and methods that we want to use that are going to be consistent with that vision. And part of the reason I was playing this out is because I think that we as a Jewish community are oftentimes inconsistent. We want to envision ourselves as being a big tent, but we actually are operating ourselves as though we are a synagogue, right, with a much more protective piece. But to the extent that it was judgmental, that wasn't my
Well, one more comment about it.
Yeah.
I would take seeking to understand, and I would put it in between each one of them. I wouldn't make it on one end. I think that on whatever end you are, seeking to understand is key to being community. Even if you're not going to be comfortable in this community, let's at least seek to understand each other and understand the integrity of the conversation, whether you decide this is going to be for you or not.
There's one concept that keeps running through my head in this discussion, and that's humility. And I wonder what role that has to play here. What are the circumstances where humility is rewarded? And because often the opposite has a lot of rewards. And your comments about power, I think there's obviously a special need for humility when there's power involved.
Well, I'll start. I think that we need to take what we are doing really seriously, because I think that the conversations like this are of the utmost importance in the Jewish community today. I just don't think we should take ourselves that seriously. Moses isn't waiting for us to come up with the exact understanding. We're part of a larger conversation that, God willing, is going to continue. It's a privilege, and we should approach it with deep humility and openness to others.
There's a point at which I think about the need to take up space. And so the notion of humility sometimes is falsely seen as not taking up proper space. And so I would say that, yes, an internal stance of humility and asking great questions and realizing we don't have all the answers. And yet also there could be a time in which we have heard a lot, and then it's time to really take up space. And even if that taking up that space means, and then having the humility to let another person come in and take that space as well. But I don't know, as I hear that notion of humility, I in myself, I push back and say, yeah, there's a place for humility always. Internally, I think we should always have an internal stance of humility. And yet I think that there are times where we need to take up more space.
As I've gotten older, I've been wrong about more things, or I've recognized that I have been wrong in the past about more things, and that should lead to humility, and that can enable a certain kind of pluralism in conversation and opening the tent, because maybe I am wrong. We have a little piece of us. Maybe I'm wrong. It's easier to see someone else's perspective with that background of all the times that I've been wrong. I think, though, the mitigating piece is that to have sustained and vibrant and exciting communities that attract people, we need that fire at the center. So at some point you have to say, like, even though I might be wrong, I'm going to really 100% commit as though I'm right, and in support of what I believe in, to build something that can be vibrant, exciting, meaningful, compelling enough to attract others. So that's like the two sides of that coin. Like the humility, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you're right, maybe this is all a big mistake, but to the extent that I have to live my life and the die is cast, I'm gonna have to go in with real intense commitment, with fervor. Otherwise, no one's gonna join us in anything.
The original tent infrastructure is the Israelites in tents encamped in the wilderness, and one of the things that helps to create a not perfect, but in some ways a mythic ideal of the Jewish people as an encamped people is also that there's a tent of meeting at the center, which is where God is present. And the major transformation of Jewish history is the lack of a tent of meeting. We don't have an obvious tent of meeting. So the problem I have with humility in this context is that what I feel very urgently needed right now in our organized Jewish community is that those who are actually capable of being the drivers of a sense of purpose have to own that. And the humility of, well, there's a lot of different opinions, a lot of different stuff, is actually, it's getting in the way of the need for who's responsible for building the fire at the center of Jewish life? And whether it's philanthropy or the organized Jewish community or the less organized Jewish community or Jewish leaders or rabbis, we're ultimately responsible. Some of the best leadership wisdom I ever got was the first time I was a camp counselor. And the camp, our division head said to us this phrase that has always stuck with me, which is, "We are they." He said, you were a camper, and there was always they. There was people making decisions that you didn't like. You are they. We are they. You're in charge now, and you own it. So at a certain point, when do we as Jewish leaders, from whatever position we're in, say, this is the moment we live in Jewish history, and if there's one thing that I really want from the standpoint of our organization, our institution, the reason we work with ideas and the reason that we push on leadership is to challenge the leaders who are alive at this point in Jewish history to say, you are responsible. What Judaism is going to mean, what Judaism will mean in 100 years from now is written now. The Torah is being written now. It's being developed by scholars and thinkers now. It's the vibrant institutions that are going to survive 30 years from now are being created now. What does it mean for us to be responsible? And this mission, this mandate of building a resilient community that actually stands for something and that has tools and technologies that make possible for people to be included, that's just feels to me like one of the great moral urgencies of what we're trying to do.
We are they now.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.